Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's learning session, REDD.X Tracking REDD Finance, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns, and I am a manager for Learning and Communications. Our presenters today are Jessica Breitfeller and Brian Skopp, both of Forest Trends. And we will also have a quick introduction to the topic from Peter Graham, who is the leader of the WWF Forest and Climate Program. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. And for those of you who've been in on past sessions, this sounds familiar, so thank you for listening again. But yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are also two audio options. You can listen via your computer, or you can dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to keep in mind that if you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this is sometimes caused by having too many software or internet browser windows open. So feel free to close some of those, and that usually solves the problem, or you're always welcome to join by phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send Jenny Guzman, my colleague, a message via the chat area if possible, and we will try to get you sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions in using the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time, which is 1 hour today. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to the place on YouTube where you can find the recording of this learning session as well as our previous learning sessions. So thank you again, and with that we'll get started, and I will turn it over to Peter Graham to give a brief introduction, and I will have this overview slide up so that after that we can get with Jess and Brian. Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you, Breen, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar on tracking REDD+ Finance presented by Jess and Brian from Forest Trends. We are really happy that they are able to share their latest findings from the REDDX initiative, as I feel it addresses important areas of WWF's forest and climate work, both in our international policy advocacy and also in scaling up the implementation of REDD+ activities in countries. As many of you will know, the REDD+ finance landscape is made up of a diverse set of governments, agencies, institutions, funds, and various players. And this landscape is constantly evolving due to changing needs and priorities. Also changes due to lessons learned, as well as innovation and new participants coming in and others leaving. So helping us to see this landscape more clearly and monitoring its changes is where I feel that REDDX really serves as a valuable resource. But I'm going to stop there and leave it to Jess and Brian to explain further. So thanks again, and over to Jess and Brian.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So as Breen said, I'm Jessica Breitfeller, and I am the Latin American Associate here at REDDX. Have been working with the program for the last 2 years. And I'm going to let Brian introduce himself very briefly as well.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Brian Skopp. I'm the Africa Associate here at Forest Trends on the REDDX project. And I will let Jess kick us off here, and then I will jump in about halfway through.
Great. So for an overview this morning, I will be providing you guys with a bit of background and an introduction to the REDDX initiative, sort of its development, the methodology that we use, which sort of sets us apart from some of the other REDD+ finance tracking initiatives that are out there. And then Brian and I will together present some of our preliminary findings. Most of this data is going to be based on our 7-country analysis, which is available via the REDDX website. And we'll delve into some of those trends in these individual countries a little bit further, and then discuss some of the broader findings and summarize the next steps for REDDX and how REDDX can be used within the International Policy Forum, and then move on to questions and open up the floor and hear what you guys have to say. So, in general, most people know that a lot of money has been contributed to the REDD+ process in order to prepare developing countries for the REDD Plus mechanism. However, despite there being a lot of money contributed, there was relatively, and still is relatively, little information surrounding how this money is being used, particularly at the country level. Currently, there are gaps in sort of this dearth in information around the types of mechanisms used for dispersing funds to different players on the ground. There's also questions surrounding the amount of money being passed on during individual transactions or financial flows. So what's being taken out by intermediaries for things like overhead and operational costs. And there has been sort of this dearth in information surrounding what types of activities are actually being financed by this large sum of money. And additionally, a lot of people, I think everybody, really wants to know what happens when this money hits the ground. How is it reaching beneficiaries, helping communities? And so that's something that the REDDX initiative was started in order to explore. Next. Okay, so we were launched in 2011, and we're supported by ICI Germany and the Skoll Foundation with the ultimate goals of improving transparency and identifying gaps and needs. And as I said before, this is primarily at the country level. So analyzing what type of funding is being given to countries against their national REDD strategies, and with stakeholder input to sort of figure out what's needed on a country-by-country basis, given their own political context, their own environmental context, that sort of thing. And then the last goal is to identify the strengths and weaknesses of various approaches. So there are different ways of delivering this funding, and so our initiative attempts to explore these ways. What's the most efficacious, what's the fastest, what's the safest given corruption and other sort of micropolitics that can occur within a country. So the REDDX initiative consists of 14 country partners, and we've spent probably the last 3 years really building up this network in order to ensure that they have in-depth knowledge of REDD Plus processes in their own country. We handpicked these partners because we really wanted sort of a neutral, trusted source that had relationships with all types of REDD Plus stakeholders as well as the national government. And this is primarily because it's fairly difficult to obtain this type of financial information, which is often either confidential or in many cases not necessarily given out publicly, although it should be publicly accessible. So in order to obtain it, we really needed trusted organizations who were sort of in the know with both international donors, national ministries, for example, as well as other REDD Plus stakeholders on the ground. And this is sort of what sets us apart and differentiates us from many of the other REDD Plus tracking initiatives out there. It's this network of partners who collect the data via in-person interviews and through our survey processes. So it's primary data collection rather than secondary data collection via publicly available sources and documents. So of course this is sort of a tremendously difficult and time-intensive process. But it really allows us to obtain the type of information that is not available elsewhere and present it. And then we even take it a step further. We hold annual data validation processes every year. And so we started in 2000, as I said, we started in 2011 with 4 pilot countries, and then brought on additional 10 countries in subsequent years, including Ethiopia, which was brought on with GIZ money. And we're hoping to add additional partners given if we end up securing additional funding. However, as I said, today's webinar will focus primarily on our 4 pilot countries, so Ghana, Brazil, Ecuador, and Vietnam, as well as Colombia, Liberia, and Tanzania. Next. So I explained a little bit about a REDD.X methodology. As mentioned, it is really what makes us unique. We start off with the data collection processes, which again is primary data collection, face-to-face interviews with multiple stakeholders. It's rather time-intensive. And then we go on to the data review and validation process, in which we sit with our in-country partners here at Forest Trends and really work with them to cross-reference the data, as well as cross-reference the data with our donor connections here in DC to ensure that we're reporting on specific numbers. Afterwards, we hold annual national validation and review workshops in order to obtain stakeholder consensus and really get government buy-in. And this is allowing us to have better coordination and is beginning to sort of allow us to do gaps and needs assessments in individual countries. For example, last month we just held our Colombia workshop, and during that it became apparent that certain eco-hotspots were underfunded, and so there was a discussion around how the country itself, as well as the international donors who were attending, such as GIZ and the Netherlands, could begin to funnel more money towards these really important biologically diverse forests that up until this point had not been receiving enough money to really be protected under the REDD+ mechanism. And so after these national validation workshops, we sort of take all these tidbits from the national review workshop. We take the analysis, we do it in conjunction with our international partners and work together to synthesize it and then write up different types of communications products, including our country reports, our international global synthesis reports, and also disseminate this information via the web. So the website is an interactive website. It has infographics, and it sort of provides additional information. So as you can see here, this is the first cut of our data. We tend to start out by tracking cumulative commitments and disbursements. As you can see by the map, the light green represents commitments, while the dark green bubbles represent disbursements. This can also be shown in other ways. So this aggregate picture again depicts both our commitments and disbursements within those 7 countries I mentioned earlier. And it should be mentioned that in general, this is sort of the trend that we see across our countries, where over the years additional funding has been provided and has also been dispersed at the aggregate level. It should be mentioned, however, that the disbursement levels appear to be a little bit lower, and this is due to time lag. A lot of times individual grants will be for multiple years, and so the disbursement rate on an individual grant may take a little bit longer, and so these appear to be artificially low, but in general they're fairly low compared to the level of commitments that we've seen across the board. Here again is another way to sort of cut that data. This graph depicts the different countries and what the amounts of money they've received over the years. As you can see, Brazil is in the turquoise there. It dominates. It's received quite a substantial amount of money throughout 2009 to 2012. Although it's not in the graph, the only other REDD.X country that has received more money than Brazil is Indonesia. We can also see Tanzania there in the yellow, and unlike Brazil, they actually received a substantial amount of money in 2009 from Norway, but has received nearly nothing since. While Colombia and Ecuador have received large amounts in 2011, and Ghana and Vietnam have also received large commitments in 2012. And so if we zoom into the country level, which depicts what we were just looking at on the other graph, but by individual countries, cumulative commitments and disbursements, we can see sort of that Ghana has the normative trend of varying levels of finance, but primarily an increasing commitments and disbursements over time. That sort of follow the pattern of when REDD Fast Start Finance was given. So there was an uptake in 2011 with substantial increases in 2012 and 2013. However, in some countries, as always, the trends sort of vary depending on them. As we can see here in Tanzania, cumulative commitments and disbursements have been relatively stagnant. Disbursements have increased, however, they received a substantial amount of money, primarily from Norway, in 2009 and have received very little funding since 2012. And this is primarily due to some issues between the government and the major donor there, Norway.
Great, thanks, Jess. So let's take a look here more closely at who the major donors are that are funding REDD+. So this chart here is, again, aggregate statistics from the 7 countries that Jess had mentioned previously, in which we discussed in our most recent synthesis report. As you can see here up at the top, the largest donors that we've tracked so far overall have been donor governments in the red. And then following that, multilateral institutions have been generally the second largest sector of contributors. And finally, down in the orange, private foundations have also been pretty significant in their contributions. Interesting to note that Norway up top has been the largest donor overall among these 7 countries by far. And this top row doesn't even include contributions from these countries to multilateral funds. So these are just bilateral commitments to specific countries. But in actuality, these countries have actually contributed more if you would include their funding to the multilaterals. And we often discount the role of private foundations, but I think it's important to note that they are really significant contributors. So the Moore Foundation, for instance, back in the last slide, contributed $40 million, which is comparable to the contributions of UN REDD. So really important to realize that private foundations have played an important role. So cutting the data a different way here, this chart also shows donor commitments by sector, by year. So clearly, again, donor governments are the main contributors, followed by multilaterals, private foundations. Interesting trends to note that over the 4-year period, donor government commitments remain fairly steady. As you can see, the red bubble sizes don't really change. Also, private foundation commitments held pretty steady. They're in the orange. But multilaterals have been increasing each year, which has been a trend that we've identified that's been pretty interesting. So you can see, especially in 2011, 2012, they really grew. And then one other interesting trend to note, the 4th row down, the pink, sort of pink bubbles, those are contributions from REDD+ country governments themselves. And this is an often under-recognized source of funding for REDD, is domestic contributions. But it's in some cases pretty significant. So we can see here in 2012 there's a huge jump in these contributions. This is mostly related to commitments from the government of Ghana in co-financing for the Forest Investment Program, which I'll talk about a bit later. But we can see there's a range of other donor types, but the most important ones are the top few. So now if we zoom into the country level here and sort of drill down deeper into the data, we take the example of Ecuador. And this chart here is a useful chart that we developed for all of our countries, and it gives a quick overview of who the main donors are and how much they've dispersed. So we can see there were 7 donors tracked to Ecuador through the end of 2011, and the size of the bubbles is proportional to their total commitments. So the outer bubble is the commitments, the inner bubble is the proportion that had been dispersed. And we can see that as of the end of 2011, disbursements were very low. Only about 2% of all committed funds had been dispersed. But if we fast forward 1 year to the end of 2012, disbursements drastically increased from 2% to 41%. And you can see commitments also grew. There are some new donors there in the chart, but really the interesting trend is that how much can change in a year. And this really points to why we do our annual cycles of data collection, because it's a rapidly changing environment, as Peter mentioned in his intro, and it's important to really update the data regularly because so much can change. So this graphic here has been a useful tool for us. because it prevents a quick snapshot of what's happening in the country, and we can update it regularly. And it's useful for donors and for REDD country governments to just quickly see who are the primary donors, who's having issues with disbursements, or who's doing a really good job of dispersing funds. And in general, some of the trends we've been finding, which are sort of evident in this chart, but which I'll talk about more later, are that multilateral institutions have been generally slower at dispersing funds, as well as donor governments, while in contrast, private foundations have tended to have the highest disbursement rates. And this is partly because foundations usually contribute smaller amounts of funding, and they also tend to have less formalized and some might say bureaucratic processes for disbursements. So this chart here allows us to start looking at who the recipients are. So we've covered the donors, who's funding REDD. Let's look more closely now at who the money is going to. So this chart is again an aggregation of the 7 countries that we studied in our first report, which we released a few months ago. And as you can see here, we've tracked close to $1.2 billion in these 7 countries through 2012. And the chart shows, first of all, that reveals some of our methodology, that we track the full chain of recipients. So money comes from donors, it goes to first in-country recipients, and these first recipients either spend all the money themselves on program activities, or they may pass a portion of the funding on to additional secondary recipients, which we see happening here. This chart is a bit skewed by the presence of Brazil and its huge amount of finance. So we can see the largest first recipient is the Amazon Fund, which received over half of the total commitments to these 7 countries. But then after the Amazon Fund, we see REDD country governments receiving the next largest portion at about 18.5%, which is fairly common, what we might expect. And then below that, we see donor government agencies in country receiving the next largest portion. And this is a trend I'll discuss a bit later. Other main recipients include NGOs from main country or international NGOs, multilateral implementing agents, international consultancies, and a variety of others. So if we take the example of Ghana just to sort of highlight the trends of how flows are happening, this chart is through 2013. It's our most updated data, which we have for a few countries now, and which we hope to have soon for all of our countries. As you can see here, again, the donors and recipients are organized by category, and the donors on the left, one important trend, you can see the label here, we tend to, sometimes entities that we call donors are actually functioning more like international intermediaries. For instance, like an international NGO that gets funding from somewhere else and then passes it on. If we can't track this funding backwards to the original donor, we usually just call them the donor, just for the sake of simplicity. So here in this chart, a couple trends to highlight, which speak to broader patterns that we've been noticing. As you can see here, the main source of financing is multilateral institutions, providing 59 million overall. And that's composed mainly of money from the World Bank's Forest Investment Program. And another source of financing is the Ghanaian government. We can see here it was the 2nd largest contributor, and as I mentioned, it contributed close to $40 million in co-financing, mostly to support the Forest Investment Program. And these are mostly in-kind contributions, things like staff time, donation of office space, things like that, but it's still quite a significant contribution. And then when we go over to the right, we can see that the vast majority of funding has been going to the Ghanaian government itself, which is a fairly conventional sort of arrangement, what we might expect, REDD money going to governments. But there are other ways that this can happen, which we'll talk about next here. So let's contrast the situation in Ghana with that in Tanzania. And as we see here, rather than multilaterals or the Tanzanian government being the main donor, as was the case in Ghana, the main donor here is external governments, and they are sending money mostly to themselves, which is an interesting trend that's sort of unique to Tanzania, at least in its scale. And what's happening here is the Norwegian government is the main donor, representing about 80 million of the 84.5 million you're seeing there. And it made the decision to funnel all of its commitments through its own embassy in Tanzania. And we can speculate as to why that might be the case. There are many potential reasons. One thing to note is that the embassy is then passing on the majority of this funding to other recipients, which is not included in this chart. But on our website, we have other charts that indicate this. So it's not as if the embassy is spending all this money themselves, but it's acting as the intermediary, which is a fairly different arrangement, we could say, than what's happening in other countries. So this points to the diversity, again, of the ways this funding can be arranged. We see here, again, that multilaterals are providing some finance here. This is mostly UN REDD. And then among recipients, multilateral implementing agents are a main recipient. And this speaks to a pattern that we've been noticing, which is that many multilateral donors channel their money through multilateral implementing agents, we call them. So these are, the prime example of this is UN REDD, which gives almost all of its money to in-country offices of UNDP, UNEP, and FAO. So we see that happening here in Tanzania, and this is happening in many of our countries. And again, although those are the major trends, we can see there's a variety in terms of who are the donors. We also have some foundations involved, a little bit of co-finance from the government, and then a range of recipients. So ultimately, our goal, as Jess had mentioned, is that we want to be able to track finance all the way down to the ground level. But this is complex and it takes time for a few reasons. First, because when the money goes to first recipients, it takes time for them to, in turn, pass it on to additional second or third recipients. And it takes time for our consultants in country to track these flows and report back to us. But in Colombia, this is an example of the data in Colombia. We've done a really good job of tracking a lot of this finance through the chain. So you can see here, again, all the entities are organized by sector, color-coded, and the flows between them are shown in the green. So light green is commitments, dark green is the portion that's been dispersed. And obviously the chart shows quite a range of first and second recipients. And the main flow is coming from USAID, going to Chemonics International Consultancy. So over 60% of the finance in Colombia is coming from USAID going to Chemonics. And it's mostly the Bio-REDD program, so funding 20 local level projects, REDD projects. And this chart is useful for us because it provides in one place a comprehensive picture of the REDD situation, REDD finance situation in each country. So we have one of these charts for all of our countries on our website. And it's a really useful kind of one-stop shop to see what's going on. And recently we've updated our website to have this chart be interactive. So I would encourage you to check that out. 6 of our countries now have this chart as interactive. You can click on the donors, hover over them, and more information pops up. You can click on the flows or hover over the flows between donors and recipients and see how much has been committed, how much has been dispersed. So lots of good information I would encourage you to look at. And we have this chart updated in that format for Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, Ghana, Tanzania, and Liberia. And as I said, we're currently working to make that chart for all of our countries. So beyond simply tracking finance and numbers, we're also looking at the types of activities that REDD Finance is supporting. So this encompasses a range of activities from phase 1 types of readiness activities like stakeholder engagement, rights and tenure, MRV and reference levels, safeguards, policy and law development, institutional strengthening, all these sorts of things, ranging on to phase 2 implementation activities like improved forest and land management, and forest carbon project design, all the way through to phase 3 performance-based payments. So you can see at the top of this chart the range of activities we're tracking, and then we're comparing these against the different donor sectors. So which types of donors are supporting which types of activities. And we can see here the green check mark indicates that yes, this donor type is supporting this activity. The gray X shows no, we have not so far tracked that this donor is supporting this activity. And our website includes this chart for every country. This example here is from Peru. And as we can see here, and kind of drawing on all of our other charts in the aggregate, we found that most of the REDD finance at this point has supported readiness activities. So the focus in many countries has been on things like stakeholder consultation and institutional strengthening. But recently we've started to see an increase in support for some of the end stage activities like forest carbon project design and performance-based payments. And this initial focus on readiness is of course to be expected. Readiness has to precede later stage activities, and you have to have the foundation in place before you can start to issue performance-based payments. But it does highlight the need for continuing progress that needs to be made to move beyond readiness into some of the later stage activities. So what is all this information telling us? This chart here is a useful chart that we created recently, and it provides a snapshot of a lot of our most important metrics all in one place. So as you can see here, we have all 14 countries that we're tracking, and although this presentation is mostly focused on our first 7 countries where the data has been kind of more rigorously collected and validated, we do have preliminary data for the 7 other countries as well. So we're including it all here through 2012. And we can see a range of important metrics indicated. So the bubbles at the top above the trees, we can see they're proportional in size to total commitments. So the outer circle is amount of money committed to each country in light green. The inner dark circle is the proportion that's been disbursed, and we have the amounts listed above there. And then the size of the trees is the proportional total forest cover in each country. And then below that in red, we see the deforestation rate for each country. And then finally below, we have a metric in dollars there, which indicates REDD dollars committed per forest hectare, which is a simple, kind of a simple metric, but it helps to compare the really important variables of how much finance has been committed and how does that translate to the amount of forest cover in the country. So we can ask, what is the logic of all this? What's this showing? Are the levels of funding related to the importance of these various countries for REDD+? Or is there a relationship between levels of finance, forest cover, and deforestation rates? And a quick glance at the graph shows that funding is somewhat correlated with forest size. So we can see Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico are receiving the largest amounts of commitments, and they're also among the top 5 in terms of total forest area. DRC and Peru, so DRC being the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru are a bit of outliers in that they have large areas of forest but relatively small total commitments. And this could be because they also have some of the lowest deforestation rates among the countries, but hard to say exactly what's driving these trends. But REDDX data presented in this sort of way helps donors and REDD countries begin to see what are the trends and how can we better direct donor dollars to ensure that they're targeted in a way that meets our objectives. So wrapping up here, let's talk briefly about the summary of the findings. And these are coming from our global synthesis report that we've been referencing, tracking finance in 7 countries through 2012. And we referenced some of these already, but it's nice to pull them all together here at the end. So our first finding is that REDD finance commitments have increased steadily over the 4-year period. So they started out at 240 million and ended at just about 1.2 billion by the end of 2012. We also saw that disbursements grew steadily from 500,000 at the end of 2009 to just under 380 million by the end of 2012. But although disbursements have been growing, there's still quite a gap between commitments and disbursements. And as just mentioned, this is to be expected in some ways. Many of the larger commitments we've tracked, especially the multilateral commitments, are multi-year, 4 or 5-year commitments. and the disbursements are projected to accelerate over time as the projects ramp up. So of course, in the first couple of years, they're going to be low. Projects take time to get started and off the ground. Lots of work needs to be done up front to get the foundation in place. But even acknowledging these realities, it's still a pretty serious disbursement lag in that by the end of 2012, only a third of the commitments have been dispersed. So this is something we're keeping an eye on, and we're interested to see if these trends will continue as we get our 2013 and 2014 data in and analyze it over the coming months. Additional finding number 3 is that multilateral sources of funds are really beginning to accelerate and to outpace the bilateral donors and private foundations that we find had supplied most of the early REDD finance. So in 2009 and 2010, really the main donors we were seeing were donor governments and private foundations. And then by 2011 and 2012, those commitments held steady, but multilateral funding really started to accelerate. So things like the UN REDD program, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank, and the Forest Investment Program, especially of the World Bank. So this is a trend that we've been noticing. And then number 4, we're increasingly recognizing the role of domestic contributions from REDD Plus countries. And to some of you, this may seem a little bit surprising. I think many people often think of REDD finance as being kind of a north-south transfer in which all the finance is coming from external donors going to REDD countries. But we found that this actually often isn't true. REDD country governments are, in many cases, supplying a lot of finance themselves to support REDD in their own countries. And we're just beginning to try to track this more rigorously. But some of our preliminary results show that in Colombia and Ecuador alone, for instance, these two governments have provided over $48 million of their own funding, or have committed to providing that much at least, to support REDD. And as I mentioned, in Ghana, the government has committed $36 million in co-finance to support the Forest Investment Program. So these are significant contributions and shouldn't be discounted. And then our 5th finding, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of activities, REDD readiness has been the main focus. Only 11% of the donor initiatives we've tracked went to support forest carbon project design, and only 7% of the finance we tracked supported carbon offsets and performance-based payments. So again, this is to be expected. Readiness has to happen before the later stage activities, but it needs to begin changing as REDD moves forward. And we're starting to see this, as I'll talk about in the next slide. And finally here, our 6th finding is that the private sector has really been quite uninvolved. Of the $1.2 billion in funding we tracked through 2012, only 0.1% of this finance has come from the private sector, which is virtually nothing. One caveat to that finding is that REDDX does not track voluntary carbon market investments. Our sister initiative here at Forest Trends, Ecosystem Marketplace, tracks those investments. So in some ways, the private sector investment could be larger if we were counting voluntary carbon market investments. But REDDX focuses only on activities that feed directly into national level REDD Plus preparation and implementation. So hopefully private sector investments will increase going forward because that will be pretty important. So we've talked about the trends through 2012. Obviously, it's been a couple years since then. We're getting new information in for 2013 and 2014, and based on our preliminary analysis, we can sort of begin to project what those trends are looking like. And just generally speaking, it looks like the trends I just highlighted are mostly continuing. Commitments and disbursements are increasing, and the big trend is that multilaterals are continuing to accelerate their commitments exponentially. And then one interesting trend we're finding in 2013 and 2014 preliminarily is that pledges for performance-based payments are really starting to grow. So we can see this in the growth of the Carbon Fund, of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which is really securing quite a bit of money at this point, and also increasing bilateral pledges between countries for the support of performance-based payments. So take as an example Norway's commitments to Liberia and Peru and Guyana. So there's a lot of funding increasingly being funneled towards performance-based payments. So in the end, just to summarize here, what we've, over the 4 years of our initiative, what we found to be the true value of REDDX. First of all, REDDX has really been valuable in providing a comprehensive picture of the REDD Plus landscape, finance landscape. We found that there's various mechanisms to channel REDD finance, pros and cons to these different mechanisms, but in order to really understand and evaluate trade-offs, we need to see the full picture. And this is what REDDX is helping to provide. And in doing this, REDDX is also creating understanding between the full range of stakeholders and creating transparent ways to build this understanding. So as Jess mentioned, part of our work is what we call the REDDX data validation workshops that take place in each country. And in many cases, this is the first time that stakeholders get to see a comprehensive picture of REDD finance. And it's hugely valuable for everyone to sit around the table, donors, REDD country governments, implementing partners, to say, here's what's happening in our country, where are the gaps and needs as it compares to our REDD strategy, and what are the ways that we could strategically target our new donor finance to really be effective. And then finally, REDDX is building capacity of our in-country partners to track REDD finance, which is hugely important. So our civil society partners are growing in their ability to get better and better at this work, and the governments we work with as well in REDD countries are expanding their capacity. So finally here, wrapping up, REDDX is being encouraged to expand. So a couple areas here in which we're considering expansion. Tracking domestic public finance, as I mentioned, we're really starting to do more of. Trying to target our data to do more gaps and needs analysis. Looking at possibilities for subnational or jurisdictional finance tracking rather than just national level. Doing more rigorous evaluation of various funding mechanisms and comparing them. And then finally, looking forward here as REDD Plus performance payments continue to grow, potentially looking at them in more depth and comparing them. So with that, we'll leave it there and open up the floor to questions, and I think Breen will be facilitating that.
I will, thank you. So thank you to Brian and Jess for that presentation. And at this point, we will open it up. And Peter has a question for us. And Peter, I'm actually going to unmute you, but I will. Peter, would you like to go ahead with your question? You can ask it aloud. And after Peter, we'll then have our participants make sure that they submit their questions using the question toolbar, and I'll read the rest of them.
Okay, thanks, Breen, and thanks very much, Jess and Brian. That was really helpful. It's very clear and comprehensive presentation on the work. It's, I think, clear that it is already influencing some financing policy decisions in the countries you've covered. Now, my question, well, first the context. In the context of addressing the drivers of deforestation and degradation, as part of countries' REDD Plus strategies, there is a fair bit of funding out there that is not usually labeled as REDD Plus or REDD Plus finance. And we see that this is likely to play some role, probably significant in some countries, in implementing the REDD Plus strategies and actually addressing the drivers. So this includes funding for greening or deforestation-free supply chains, a lot of investment in the agricultural sector, essentially to increase production and reduce expansion into the forest sector. Do you see potential for this type of finance that is maybe outside of the classic REDD box to be included in future REDDX updates or in the monitoring?
Sure, that's a great question. So as Brian mentioned, a lot of what we're seeing, or what we're trying to do now, is tracking domestic contributions. So we primarily have been working with the public sector and primarily the ministries of environment rather than with the ministries of agriculture, because the way in which REDD is defined by each country tends to be, within the Office of Climate Change, which primarily sits within the Ministry of Environment. And so we've been working with them to sort of go through the national REDD strategies and not just define what counts as REDD plus finance or what counts as a REDD plus activity, but also identifying across sort of their national development plans and other political implementation instruments and documents what REDD-related activities are being funded and how this might impact the overall implementation of a country's REDD plus strategy. So I think we're working towards that. It's really difficult right now because in many countries it is so siloed, and there are plenty of REDD-related activities, as you mentioned, Peter, that are going to contribute ultimately to decreased deforestation, but might not necessarily be labeled as REDD plus. So we're working in a couple new countries, including Indonesia, Liberia, Tanzania, as well as in some of our previous countries where we've been doing piloting studies on domestic contributions tracking, to really try and collaborate more with these different ministries and to bring in other land uses and land use sectors to consider how these land uses might affect the REDD plus strategy and what kind of money is going into agricultural development and low deforestation ag. We're also, some of our other sister programs here at Forest Trends, such as our Public-Private Partnerships Initiative, as well as Brian mentioned, our sister program EM, are starting to sort of track exactly this, looking at supply chains and tracking commitments to low deforestation supply chains. And we're working with them and trying to collaborate to see the kind of data that they're obtaining, primarily from the private sector and from ministries of agriculture, and how we can bring all of this together to sort of do, again, a more in-depth sort of analysis on how these will affect each other and how, in some cases, the financing might already be met due to some of the investments that have been provided to REDD-related activities such as agriculture.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so thanks to everyone who's posting their questions, and at this point I'll go ahead and read them aloud. And just as the next question, as we get to that one, I'm going to put this slide up. It's not the prettiest slide, but these are the links to the REDDX website and then to the report I think that Brian and Jess have talked about, and I will make sure that this is also in the follow-up email that you get, so you can just click through rather than looking at a long web address. So we have a couple of questions about the relationship with REDDX and the voluntary REDD database. And let's start with the first one is, what is the relationship there? And are you planning to integrate your data into this database?
Sure. So we had previously worked with the REDD, with the VRD pretty closely up until just this year when the REDD Plus partnership sort of dissolved at the COP in Lima. And we had worked with a lot of our countries actually to take the REDDX data methodology and utilize that data in their submissions to the VRD. So one prime example of this was in Liberia. Another example was we worked very closely with the Ministry of Environment in Colombia to submit their data. And basically because since the VRD is voluntary, in a lot of cases they just didn't have the same extent of information. And our methodology, since it is primary data collection, provided a bit more in-depth analysis and information to the VRD. At this point, I believe we're still sort of collaborating with our countries who would like to participate and voluntarily submit their information to the VRD, which upon the breakup of the REDD Plus partnership, I believe now sits under the FAO. So we will be working with them, those countries that are still interested, to submit our data to the VRD. However, our working relationship with them is not quite as, I guess, close or overlaid, and we're still trying to see, given the fact that the REDD Plus partnership had dissolved and that the VRD has switched hands in the last year, sort of how that collaboration will evolve in the future, and if there's a way to link back up and try and help additional countries, not just the REDDX countries, but share a methodology with other countries who may be interested in utilizing it in their submission to the VRD.
Thank you.
And one additional thing to highlight, in addition to what Jess said, there are some important differences between our data and the data of the VRD. So the way the voluntary REDD Plus database works is that any donor or recipient can just voluntarily submit information on financing they've given or received. And this kind of open source format is very helpful in some ways. But the value of the REDDX data is that it's collected and then validated at national workshops where everyone has a chance to sit down together and agree, are these numbers correct? So in some ways, the REDDX data goes through a more rigorous process of validation and cleaning.
Great. And this is a follow-up question on that same topic from one of our attendees who's from the Ivory Coast. And this person asks, can you give more information about how one would go about the process? So if Ivory Coast wants to join REDDX, for example, how would that happen? Is that possible? What are the steps? How do you decide on your countries?
Yeah, so in part the countries we're working in now are a result of the funding arrangement we have with our primary funders, the Skoll Foundation and the International Climate Initiative in Germany. We have received quite a bit of interest from additional countries in participating in the initiative. We would love to expand in the future. That's going to be dependent on securing additional funding in 2016 and beyond. So at this point, we don't really have the funding to expand in terms of hiring in-country consultants to conduct the research. But if we are able to get additional finance moving forward, we'd love to expand. I would encourage this questioner to, for instance, to get in touch with us via email, and maybe we can do some sort of informal connection and discuss possibilities further. But at this point, we're not able to expand with our current funding.
That sounds great. Is there a way to contact you through the REDDX website? Is there a contact us button there?
I'm not sure that there is. I can look into that, but I can just share my email right now, if that's okay, over the webinar.
Why don't I put you two in touch separately? I think it's better than having your email floating around the universe here. So the next question is about just, I think, logistics, and the question is, was it difficult to set up REDDX in terms of the system, and how was the cooperation between countries to use it and disclosing this information? And then the second part of that is, how is or would REDDX be linked to national MRV systems?
So in terms of setting up the network, yeah, it was quite a bit of work to identify consultants in each country, and another core imperative of our funder was to get the official agreement of each country, the REDD Plus focal point, to participate in the initiative. So we're working through our civil society partners, but the governments are all are largely on board with what we're doing. In terms of collaboration between countries, there was definitely some cross-training. For instance, our partners in Ghana, the Nature Conservation Research Center, did a lot of training for other consultants in our other African countries to get them started. We've held some international workshops with all of our partners to share lessons learned and things like that. And then in terms of our results informing country-level MRV, is that the question? Right?
Just whether or not any of this is linked in or could be linked into MRV systems?
Yeah, so, right. Obviously, MRV encompasses monitoring a lot of things. People often think about it in terms of monitoring forest cover change, but monitoring finance is also important. And there is some potential for our methodology to be adapted into what we might call REDD registries, at least the financial portion of them, where you're tracking financial transactions and making sure that everything is, on the books correctly in terms of money coming in, money going out, emissions retired, that sort of thing. So there's definitely potential for that. That's something that we would like to explore if we're able to secure more funding. But it's also something that our country partners could do on their own, just taking the lessons they've learned from our initiative.
Thank you. And so with the next question, once you start talking about it, I'm going to switch over to the next slide, which is some additional REDD resources from our side, from WWF. So the question is if you can talk a bit more about activity linked to payments to local beneficiaries in Indonesia and or in Vietnam. And I know that this person had contacted us before the webinar with a question on this topic. So Brian and Jess, I don't know if you have any information on that now, or if you need to do a little bit more research and get back to the person who asked this.
Yeah, I think it would be great to sort of sit down and hammer through that. Particularly, we might be able to put this person in touch with our on-the-ground consultants in those countries, because those countries in particular are fairly complex, especially Vietnam and Indonesia. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's our on-the-ground partners that really have, their finger on the pulse of what is occurring on the ground. And so it would be good to reach out to them and get their feedback prior to providing this answer, because I think we can provide, general summary, but they really know what's happening, particularly up-to-date information that's occurred since their 2012 tracking processes.
Perfect, thanks. So we'll make sure that you two connect with each other and can follow up on that question. So the next question is, can you say more about the small percentage of funding that came from the private sector? Are these private foundations, companies, or other types of investors?
So they're not private foundations. We categorize those separately. We're talking here about, I guess the simplest way to say it would just be for-profit corporations typically. And most of those, so we tracked 0.1% of the 1.2 billion, which I think is 1.2 million, in private sector investments. And I believe, I'd have to look closely to be sure, but most of that was in Brazil, maybe through the Amazon Fund. I don't know if Jess can speak more specifically to what those contributions might have been.
Yeah, so that was through, a lot of it was through Brazil and the Amazon Fund, and sort of public-private partnership. And additionally, there's been a bit more private sector finance going into some small projects in Colombia and Ecuador. And so we see a lot of those in the Latin American countries, or not necessarily a lot, but more than, say, the African countries. And these are primarily project developers, forestry firms that are doing pilot studies, other, U.S.-based larger corporations such as J.P. Chase and Morgan, who are interested in sort of hiring people to contributing money and trying to do these pilot studies to see if they'll, or pilot projects to see if they'll be able to utilize them under the REDD+ mechanism and or under the voluntary carbon markets. So as Brian mentioned, that sort of sector is being tracked by our sister initiative, Ecosystems Marketplace, in their Forest Carbon Portal.
Thank you. And the next question, we've touched on it.
As I said,
go ahead, Brian.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just quickly to follow up on that. So the vast majority of private sector investments are going to the voluntary carbon market, as I mentioned, which we're not mostly tracking. But these worlds are starting to come together, I think. We're seeing recently, for instance, the World Bank's Biocarbon Fund Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes is working at the jurisdictional level in 4 countries. They're just getting started, but they're really hoping to tap private sector investment more. So this is an important area moving forward.
Thank you. And the next question, as I was saying, we've touched on it a bit, but it's another clarification question on how you have selected these partner countries, I would say, in quotes. And this person asked, for Brazil and Indonesia, for example, could having the national funds have also contributed to the high commitments? And so again, can you just briefly tell us how you selected these countries that you focused on?
Sure. So we actually did not necessarily select these ourselves. This was something that was done when Forest Trends put the grant together with the International Climate Initiative with Germany. So we sat down with them and sort of identified different important REDD+ country recipients And this was based on forest cover, based on different ecosystems, size of the country, how much money they were predicting would be funneled to each of these countries. And so, you know, we picked some of these larger countries such as Brazil and Indonesia that were clearly going to be important, but also some smaller countries like Guyana, which, you know, has increased the amount of money that it's received, but also Liberia. And so it was really just sitting down with them sort of right on the cusp of when REDD was really getting started, right before Fast Start Finance, and identifying which countries would probably be you know, important within this realm and would be important to at least start tracking, in the hopes that if we did secure additional funding, we would expand our network to more countries in the future. The large commitments, primarily for Brazil and Indonesia, aren't necessarily due to national contributions. We think that there's still a lot to be tracked on that side of things. Particularly, that's something we'll be doing with Indonesia in this year's domestic tracking. However, they just have so much money, and it's primarily due to some of the pledges and performance-based payment pledges that have been provided to them, primarily by Norway as well as Germany. So,
thank you. And we're reaching the end of our time here, so I know there are a few more questions, but I'm going to call this one our last question here just to respect everybody's time for the 1 hour that we held. And after that, I will we'll see if we can get answers to these questions that we haven't had a chance to cover. So for our last question, Anna asks, for data on commitments from bilateral donors, do you use the data from OECD, which are the real markers, or cross-check your data with this? And maybe you can underscore what OECD is for everybody on the call. If you know.
I think it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We don't typically look at their data. That's an interesting direction that we should pursue. Thanks for that tip. Typically, we do. So this leads us to an interesting point that I'll make, which is that while we've described the data collection process mostly as bottom-up with our in-country partners, we also do the reverse, in which we send our data to the donor headquarters themselves and ask them to verify it. So a lot of our commitments, especially recently, we're trying to do this more and more, have been looked over by the donor country offices themselves, which, I mean, I can't really think of a better source than that. So yeah, we are trying to validate the data in many different ways as rigorously as we can.
Great, thank you. So again, we've reached the end of our time here, and thanks to all who could join today. Here's a list of some additional REDD resources, and here are some ways everyone can stay connected with us, both the WWF Forest and Climate Program and also with the Forest Trends team. And we hope that you will stay in touch. I'm always looking for feedback on REDD topics that you would like to learn more about. So if you have an idea, please feel free to send me an email, and that email address is in the follow-up note you'll receive from the GoToWebinar system. And with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you again to our presenters, to Brian and Jess, and we will see you at the next session. Thank you.